In this video, we're going to explore whether or not governments should promote virtues among its citizens, and whether or not individual citizens should draw upon their religion and culture to debate public policy. Let's get started. To really unpack these questions, we have to have some idea of what we mean when we say the good life. In philosophy, the good life refers to a life of appropriate human flourishing. That's kind of vague, and there are a number of different conceptions of what that life actually looks like. But when it comes to justice and public policy, there are two important questions that arise when we discuss the good life. First, should the state try to promote the good life among its citizens? Second, should individual citizens rely on their particular conceptions of the good life when they debate public policy? Let's begin by taking a look at how theories of justice that emphasize human freedom address these questions. These theories, which include libertarianism and Rawlsian views of justice, tend to maintain that states shouldn't take sides when it comes to the question of what the good life looks like. And because the state shouldn't take sides on this question, the state shouldn't try to promote one particular conception of the good life. The reasons why these theories of justice have this view about the state vary, but each theory tends to draw on two important ideas: freedom and consent. For libertarians, explicit consent is essential. So, if individual citizens don't explicitly consent to a particular conception of the good life, they shouldn't be forced to live by that conception of the good life. Forcing them to do so would be a violation of their negative liberty, their freedom to make choices. For those who are influenced by Kant and Rawls, hypothetical consent is what is important. For Rawls, the state can only enforce a contract upon us if we would hypothetically consent to that contract behind the veil of ignorance. If you're unsure what I mean by the veil of ignorance, take a few minutes and watch my video on John Rawls. You can find the link to it in the description below. The point is, there's a common strand here among different theories of justice that emphasize liberty. Beyond explicit or hypothetical consent, the state should aim to protect the freedom of its individual citizens so that those citizens may pursue their own conception of the good life, so long as that pursuit doesn't interfere with others pursuing their conception of the good life. In historical terms, we might say that each citizen should have the right to the pursuit of happiness, with the acknowledgement that what happiness looks like is going to differ from individual to individual and community to community. But if the state chooses to promote one version of the good life, or one understanding of happiness, then individuals or communities who have dissenting views about what the good life actually is, or what happiness actually is, aren't going to be free to pursue it. For views that emphasize human freedom, the violation of human freedom is an injustice. It follows that any state that violates the freedoms of individuals in this way is an unjust state. And so, for libertarians like Nozick and thinkers like Kant and Rawls, the state shouldn't take sides about what constitutes the good life. It should remain neutral. The legitimate role of the state is not to decide on these kinds of matters, but rather to protect the individual freedoms of its citizens so that they can make those decisions for themselves. For these theories of justice, this policy of neutrality also extends to individual citizens. For both Nozick and Rawls, the preferences of individual citizens regarding conceptions of the good life are a private matter, and so these preferences should be set aside when discussing things like public policy. To understand a bit more why this is the case, it might be helpful to explore the concept of moral frameworks. Because human beings are fundamentally relational creatures, by the time we're able to even begin thinking for ourselves, we've already been influenced by an almost unfathomable amount of sources. Unfathomable. Because words with more syllables make you sound smarter. So if I add a couple bubbas in there, it just sounds all the smarter. These different influences arise from a number of factors of our life that we have no control over. Where we're born, when we're born, to whom we're born, the community into which we are born. We have no control over these factors, but they influence our beliefs profoundly. Think about it. If you were born 200 years ago on the opposite side of the world, in a culture and to parents with radically different values, do you think you would have the same beliefs that you have now? I would argue that the chances that you would have the same beliefs are infinitesimal. Infinitesimal. The reason is, as we grow up and our minds mature, we develop our beliefs within the context of our social influences. And these influences provide us with frameworks about how we view the world, how we interpret it, including how we interpret values and morals. I've discussed this in a previous video. Actually, I remember it as if it were yesterday. Carl, I'm clearly trying to do a flashback here. Can you do the thing? As I was saying, I remember it as if it were yesterday. Morality refers to a set of standards that a particular group holds. A moral framework, then, refers to this set of standards, particular set of standards that we might hold because we belong to a particular group. Now, the tricky thing about moral frameworks is, it's not like we just have one. If you think about all the different groups or factors that influence your morality, you'll probably notice that there are a number of them. Your family, your peers, your political affiliation, your religion, your education, your own experience. It seems safe to assume that most people don't have a single moral framework, but rather an amalgam of moral frameworks that come together
together to create kind of a Franken framework.
No, Carl, I don't care if you liked me more back then. I really, really don't. I liked you more before you were born. Now, when we think about the different moral frameworks that make up our own view of the world, we might ask the question, which of these frameworks are acceptable to draw upon when we're discussing and debating public policy? One thing that's probably true of your various frameworks is that they each contain some conception of what the good life looks like. For example, our parents, our cultures, our religions probably taught us that there are some things we should value and some things that we shouldn't value. Some characteristics we should strive for and other characteristics we should avoid. But if it's true that the state and individual citizens should remain neutral on the question of what constitutes the good life, then it follows that these moral frameworks aren't appropriate to draw upon when we're discussing public policy. And so, for Nozick and Rawls, we should set these frameworks aside when we're having such discussions. In fact, this is one of the central ideas behind Rawls's conception of the veil of ignorance. In place of these various moral frameworks, thinkers like Nozick and Rawls suggest that we ought to adopt a different kind of moral framework, what we might call the public policy moral framework. This is essentially a master framework that everyone who debates public policy should be able to agree upon. This framework is devoid of things like familial traditions, religious positions, and cultural norms. For this reason, some refer to it as a thin framework. This raises a question. What does the framework actually consist of? Michael Sandel identifies a few characteristics that are central to this framework: tolerance, freedom of choice, fairness, and rationality. Let's take some time and evaluate this policy of neutrality. Positively, there are some very appealing aspects of this position. Let's consider two important ones. First, the position of neutrality makes it difficult for a majority group to impose its religious or cultural values on a minority group. If the state has to remain neutral on a conception of the good life, then it has to remain silent on the question of which religion is true, which virtues are actually virtues, and which cultural norms are best. In the past, states that haven't embraced this kind of neutrality have sometimes acted rather abrasively. For example, the European colonization of the Americas included a radical rejection of conceptions of the good life that were held by indigenous peoples, who were pressured, and at times downright coerced, to abandon their religious values and their cultural heritage. Second, the public policy moral framework provides a common set of rules for debating public policy that can help us to avoid policy stalemates. For example, when discussing issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and climate change, individual citizens aren't able to avoid providing rationale for their positions by simply relying upon their religious sensibilities. We can't just say, well, God says it in the Bible, therefore we should do it. Instead, we have to work within a common moral framework that emphasizes reason and fairness, thus respecting all citizens equally. Those are two immensely substantial positives, so why would anyone reject the idea of neutrality? Let's take a look at 4 reasons. First, pure neutrality is something of a myth. Rawls can suggest that we all set aside specific information about ourselves behind a veil of ignorance as we discuss what would be a just constitution, but in reality, we're not really able to do that. We just don't know what it would look like to remove our entire lived narrative away from us as individuals. This narrativectomy, can we trademark that, Carl? Because it's got a lot of syllables and it sounds smart. I win a quarter every time someone says it. Would arguably remove what makes us who we are, because our lived narratives are so central to our identities. In other words, to live life as a human being is to live life in a particular time, at a particular place, in the context of particular social relationships that influence us. That's part of the essence of being human, and we inevitably develop moral frameworks as a result of this reality. So we really can't escape our moral frameworks. They influence how we see the world and how we answer controversial questions like, when does life begin? And if you think about it, people who are supposed to be neutral still seem to be influenced by their own moral frameworks when they are engaging in neutral decision making. For example, we could all talk about whether the Supreme Court is conservative or liberal. We can also talk about where those values are actually coming from. Consider this interesting test. If you removed all of your moral frameworks and tried to act neutrally, would you still act in a way that seems to honor those moral frameworks? In other words, would you come to the same conclusions as you would if you were drawing upon those moral frameworks? If you would, it seems doubtful that you're actually engaging in something like neutrality. Second, historically speaking, it is dangerous to draw upon moral frameworks like religion to shape public policy. But it's also dangerous, and maybe in some cases more dangerous, to pretend like we are being neutral when we are still being shaped by those frameworks. Religion can be dangerous because if we think God is on our side, we're likely to harm or kill or set aside people who disagree with us. However, if we convince ourselves that we're acting in absolute neutrality, we're also likely to consider anyone who disagrees with us completely unreasonable, and also seek to set them aside or to silence them in order to get the reasonable position across. But if we're not actually being neutral, this is extremely dangerous. And people who have claimed to act from a position of neutrality have done a lot of damage in the past. For example, consider the Supreme Court ruling on the issue of eugenics in Buck v. Bell. Third, while tolerance is a value of neutrality, the kind of tolerance envisioned in neutrality doesn't really create a space of robust public debate where citizens bring who they are, their own ideas and identities, to the table for discussion. In other words, it's not really an open forum, because moral frameworks that don't meet the criteria of the public policy moral framework aren't welcome. But we might ask if that's what a thriving democratic society, or constitutional republic, ought to look like. In other words, do we want a tolerance that's built upon the complete avoidance of competing moral frameworks, one that requires us to set aside the things that make us who we are, or do we want a tolerance that's built upon a respectful dialogue of competing moral frameworks? Finally, we might ask if the public policy moral framework is actually neutral. After all, it does suggest what the good life looks like in the public sphere. It has virtues, respect for liberty, fairness, tolerance, and it has vices, for instance, drawing on your own conception of what the good life looks like in order to discuss public policy. But it's important to note that the emphasis on human freedom is not an objectively neutral view. It's a view that is itself part of a tradition, the tradition that's given to us through the Enlightenment. A tradition that emphasizes individuals divorced from their social relationships. A tradition that gives us a particular telos of what it means to be human. For example, to be a free, rational, or autonomous creature. Suppose for a moment that we felt dissatisfied by a position of neutrality. What might an alternative look like? Sandow argues that we ought to reject the position of neutrality for what we might call mutuality. To explain what mutuality might look like, I'm going to use an analogy of 3 different families gathering together for Thanksgiving dinner. Each family in this analogy has a lot of people that gather together for Thanksgiving dinner, and each family has a lot of diversity in terms of religious, political, and philosophical viewpoints. The first family maintains peace at the dinner table by just banning certain topics. There's no talk of religion or virtue or the good life. People get along well for the most part because the moral framework through which they discuss things is always thin. Only reason is allowed at the table. And if you can't explain your position with reasons that all people at the table would accept as legitimate, you're not allowed to bring up your position. This family represents the idea of neutrality. The second family always devolves into an all-out war. I mean, it's no-holds-barred MMA kind of violence. People shout, no one listens, people get hurt, everyone goes home angry. Now that sounds like Thanksgiving, am I right? And people who are in the minority in terms of religious positions or political positions are always bullied by people who are in the majority view. This family represents non-neutrality, but specifically non-neutrality without respect. And honestly, it's pretty much how most of our political conversations on social media happen. The third family engages in rigorous debate about everything: religion, politics, culture, the good life, and so on. But everyone is allowed to speak their piece. Everyone is heard and respected. Don't get me wrong, people disagree, sometimes vehemently, but they listen to one another. They don't tolerate one another by avoiding each other's moral frameworks. They tolerate one another by engaging in each other's moral frameworks in a manner that is mutually respectful. This family represents something close to what I think Sandow has envisioned, and what I've labeled mutuality. Mutuality invites people to draw upon their various moral frameworks to debate public policy. It calls for a respectful, thick dialogue. That is, a dialogue that's not necessarily stripped down to a public policy moral framework. It welcomes people to draw upon their religious identities, their cultural backgrounds, their familial traditions, and other moral frameworks to make an argument about what the good life ought to look like and how public policy should reflect that. Sandow acknowledges that this approach has a lot of loose ends. For instance, it's unclear how we should proceed when we arrive at a pure stalemate about what constitutes the good life, and how to avoid slipping into majority rule situations. However, the position does have the benefit of embracing what it means to be human, to be a historical creature influenced by our social interactions and our relationships, to develop moral frameworks over time. In other words, it doesn't require us to pretend to be something that we really can't be. Neutral. In this video, we discuss the role of the state and individual citizens in debating public policy. We considered the position of neutrality, including its benefits and drawbacks, and also considered the position of mutuality. There are legitimate debates about how to proceed considering these differences, but the point is to discuss how we even have those debates. So what do you think? Should we aim for neutrality, or should we aim for mutuality? Or is there some other position that we can consider? I hope you've enjoyed this video series on ethics and justice. Until the next video series, farewell.